I know this is like a $1 billion question, but are we going to see Taiwan invasion in our lifetime?
I think that likelihood seems to be higher and higher.
There is so much domestic pressure about this that how could they just let it linger for another 20, 25 years?
A dramatic show of force to send an increasingly sharp message. China has ended 2025 with one of its biggest ever displays of military might around Taiwan, as a warning against what it calls the separatist forces on the island. It might feel like Groundhog Day. Chinese drills practicing a blockade of the self-ruled island are becoming more and more routine. But this latest one follows a deal for the United States to sell a record value of arms to help the Taiwanese defend themselves. In 2027, China's People's Liberation Army turns 100. So how many more years is the Chinese leader Xi Jinping willing to wait? And why aren't people in Taiwan all that worried about the possible invasion? I'm Mariko in Singapore, and this is Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service. Twice a week, we bring you Asia Pacific stories, unpacked by those who know them best. And today I have William Young from a think tank Crisis Group in Taipei, and also Bill Birtles from our Asia Pacific podcast team, a former Taiwan and China correspondent. Welcome both.
Thanks, Mariko. I'm very excited to have William on the podcast because he's like the go-to man when anybody rolls into Taipei. There was this big exodus of China-based journalists around the pandemic period. It was getting harder for them to stay in China, and a lot of them set up shop, including me, in Taipei. And William Young was basically the first person you'd seek out to get the lowdown on not just how the sort of media works in Taiwan, but also where to get the best ruchao Taiwanese food. So quite exciting to have him on the podcast.
Indeed. So nice to have you, William. I guess we want to start with these military drills. They have been taking place quite frequently, especially since 2022. So can you firstly tell us what's different this time?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I think what is really different this time is perhaps I think, number one, external environment. There is a lot more uncertainty coming out of the United States when it comes to the Trump administration's policy toward Taiwan and China. Uh, and at the same time, I think because of that, there is a greater level of skepticism and also anxiety within Taiwan about how exactly is his government going to handle relationship with China and Taiwan. And I think at the same time, because of the recent rise of tension between Japan and China due to the new Japanese Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi's comments about Taiwan contingency, there is also, I think, a lot more focus on how Japan might actually react to the whole exercise this time around. But I think other than that, we are also seeing the Chinese military being more confident and more bold when it comes to declaring the goals that they want to achieve through this exercise.
Yeah, we did a whole episode, didn't we, Bill, on Sanai Takaichi's comment. She was answering, I guess, a question in Parliament where she said that Japan's self-defense force could step in if China attacked Taiwan. I understand that this time, this is the first time these drills have been publicly associated with deterrence of outside military intervention. So is that what you're referring to? This is a clear message to Washington and Tokyo, not just to Taipei?
Yeah, exactly. I think that being so explicitly described and also laid out in the readout is definitely something unusual compared to similar exercises in the past.
I'm wondering also about the role of President Lai in Taiwan, because China had those military drills during his inauguration in 2024, and they've also released a series of cartoons depicting him as a parasite. So, Bill, it seems quite clear that Beijing doesn't like this guy.
Yeah, for about a decade now, the Chinese government has made it very clear that it doesn't want to deal with the governing Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP in Taiwan. First of all, it was President Tsai Ing-wen. She was basically shut out from high-level contact with the Chinese government, which was a departure from what was happening in the years preceding her. You had the KMT was in power, the other main political party at the time in Taiwan, and they had a much more, I guess you'd say, conciliatory approach to China. A much more, let's talk, let's negotiate, let's hold the line in terms of, Taiwan sovereignty, but let's try and have a workable relationship with Beijing, which was resulting in the opening of more trade and direct flights between the island and China and all this sort of stuff. And then once Tsai Ing-wen and the DPP got in, there was a real hardening of the attitude from China's government, things like restrictions on Chinese tourists being able to go to Taiwan. And then she was re-elected at the very beginning of 2020, and then William Lai, the current president, was her successor. So you've had this political party in power in Taiwan now for about a decade or so, where the Chinese government has basically said, first of all, we're not going to deal with you unless you completely change your stance in a way that's favorable to what we want. And then it's really escalated, it seems, with William Lai, where they are really using dehumanizing language and cartoons about this leader, depicting him as a parasite or a worm. The messaging was clear that they are going to really put pressure on him, his party, and the side of Taiwan that doesn't advocate for the island becoming its own independent sovereign nation, but takes the stance that we basically already are. So we don't need to do anything to try and appease China and its demand that we go under its control. And once again, in some of the images or propaganda that the Chinese military has released, there once again has been a reference to green bugs, which harks back to those earlier cartoons about the Taiwanese president.
Yeah, I've noticed Beijing's cartoons or the Chinese cartoons of Sanai Takaichi since that row as well. But it does seem like Beijing's language is escalating. The Chinese military describing this latest military exercise as a shield of justice. So here's some of the language from a spokesperson from the Eastern Command of the PLA.
It's a stern warning against Taiwan separatist forces and external interference, and a legitimate and necessary action to safeguard China's sovereignty and national unity.
Yeah, because 2027 is the year that some overseas experts consider as the year that maybe China would be ready to invade Taiwan. I mean, one would think that Xi Jinping wants to see this happen while he's in power. So, what kind of deadline, what kind of time frame are you thinking, William?
I think 2027 is obviously now being viewed and embraced both by the US government and also the Taiwanese government as a time or a timestamp that they really have to be serious about. But at the same time, I think with the large-scale purge that has been taking place within the PLA and the very frequent change of the leadership, across the board with the different services that we have actually witnessed, there are also a lot of doubts about actually how effective the PLA actually is in terms of being a fighting force to actually carry out a very complicated task of attacking Taiwan and achieving reunification through a potential landing boots on the ground kind of like operation.
And I guess also the Taiwanese government has been boosting its military spending, showing that it is willing, it is trying to defend itself as well. Bill, I want to, get to how prepared Taiwanese are, because Taiwan holds its military drills as well, don't they? And you've covered both the Taiwanese, but also the Chinese military drills. How are they different?
Well, it's a bit of a vibe thing, Mariko. We as foreign media didn't get invited along to PLA drills too often, but there was this massive naval flotilla off Qingdao it was quite a few years back, just before COVID. And so we're on a Chinese warship, aircraft carrier going by, all that sort of stuff. And the Chinese sailors were very professional, but when at one point I sort of said, I just got up to go to the bathroom. It was just across the room. And straight away, the person who's there to kind of accompany you stands up, say, can I help you, sir? And just to kind of check, where you're going. And they run a tight ship, basically. When I did drills with the Taiwanese forces, and the Hanguang annual drills is one example, but went out on the naval ships. William will know about this from his time as a journalist. It's very common for the Taiwanese media to be given quite a lot of access to the exercises that the Taiwan military puts on. And there always is a theatrical element to it because they're sort of putting on a bit of a show. But it did strike me that at times it felt a little bit not so professional compared at least to the PLA. Things like we're on board a Taiwanese warship off the east coast, off Hualien, and at the end of the exercises, the members of the Navy are kind of posing for photos with the journalists, jumping up in the air, all doing those sort of cutesy peace signs and stuff. Another time we're at Taoyuan with the army and the local reporters for stations like TVBS. They're putting the microphones in the flak jackets while they're holding guns, racing through the obstacle course, doing pieces to camera. Actually, it was pretty entertaining just to watch it. But I did think there was a casualness to it, a friendliness to it, which didn't scream, we're on a war footing. Whereas the PLA, everything they put out from a propaganda perspective, every instance in which they try to portray their operations, they're trying to say, we're on a war footing. And this is one of the takeaways that I think a lot of visitors have when they go to Taiwan, and they're somewhat surprised that civil society, maybe the military to some degree, just doesn't seem to have that ready for action intensity that you might expect given the situation. So how will that actually affect the ability of Taiwan's forces to respond in real combat? I'm not sure, but one thing I do want to ask William is here in Singapore, we have a Singaporean colleague who's just done the annual military service. He's into his mid-30s, but he's still going back and having to do it every year. What exactly is the situation in Taiwan these days when it comes to conscription and military service?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think the Taiwanese government is also recognizing the need for them to really beef up the training schemes, especially for the compulsory military servicemen, and at the same time increasing the frequency of, I think reservists to actually return to receive these routine trainings. But at the same time, they understand that they can't just, be as forceful with all these demands as the Chinese government, because they pride themselves as one of the freest democracies in the world and in Asia, and often use that as a big contrast to China. So I think that's where the Taiwanese government is really facing the dilemma in terms of how much they can actually start pushing very forcefully with the implementation and changes to military training schemes. And they are already facing quite a bit of a pushback domestically.
On this podcast, we've been covering quite a lot on Hong Kong and how Beijing has been tightening its grip there. Just wondering, in terms of, before the 1997 handover in Hong Kong, a lot of people left the city and some of them came back. I mean, what's the mood among locals? You said that people still going to work, doing their day-to-day stuff, and I was reading about this television show Zero Day Attack, which is kind of a fictional drama about Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which was kind of criticized by some as fear-mongering. So are Taiwanese thinking of leaving the city given these escalating tensions, or is it still seen as something in the future?
I think it's a very complicated situation. There are certainly Taiwanese people that are looking for other options for immigration. And, I think there are certain periods in the past that the certain search keywords online would actually indicate that there is a an increase of Taiwanese people looking or at least inquiring about potential ways to actually emigrate to other countries. But at the same time, I think, the Taiwanese people in general are still a lot of the times not really thinking about a Chinese military invasion as something that would happen to them in the immediate future.
Yeah, Mariko, William talking about a segment or many people in Taiwan who are just not thinking about the idea of a Chinese blockade or invasion. I think it's one of these things that baffles a lot of foreign reporters when they go to Taiwan. They all remark on it about how if you do, like a vox pop in television, where it's like the best and worst form of journalism, right? Walking up to complete strangers on the street and asking them for an opinion on something that they may or may not know anything about. But, it's a pretty common tool to try and get a little bit of a gauge of public opinion. And I always thought in Taiwan, whenever you get, say, 5 people on the street and you ask them, how concerned are you about these Chinese drills that are becoming more and more regular, the language from China? And I always thought about 1 out of 5 would say, very concerned, really, really worried. Another would probably say, yeah, pretty worried, but what can I do? And then it always felt to me like about 3 out of 5 people would say something along the lines of, yeah, they always do that. Or, gee, they're full of bluster. A bit like North Korea, isn't it? They're not going to attack. And I think that's something that baffles outsiders a lot. And I wonder, because William was saying, I don't know, a portion of Taiwan? What percentage roughly of Taiwanese would you break it down to as to what proportion is really, really worried and what percentage is not that fussed?
Yeah, I think that's a very, tricky question, but I really have to use my experience reporting on Taiwan and living in Taiwan to sort of like make a guess, I would probably say about 35% of Taiwan's population would give you the answer that they're very concerned about China preparing to attack Taiwan, while I would say maybe between 40 to 45% of the Taiwanese people are still holding on to the last bit of the hope that, the Chinese saying that Chinese people won't attack Chinese people would actually be hold true. And at the same time, they are betting on the Chinese government, not actually facing too many internal challenges to actually be able to successfully carry out an attack on Taiwan.
William, you said not many are concerned about the immediate attack by China, and many are hopeful that they would find a peaceful way. So, in your opinions, I know this is like a billion-dollar question, but are we going to see Taiwan invasion in our lifetime or no?
I think that likelihood seems to be higher and higher. I think I personally sense you know, a slight increase or gradual increase of impatience from the Chinese side. I think especially, as public opinion in Taiwan remains very solidly against the idea of reunification in general, even though, how people think about the future for Taiwan remains very divided, but there somehow is a very vague consensus among Taiwanese people that they don't want to accept or they won't be able to accept living under reunification with China. So as China, I think, sense that the possibility of reunification through peaceful means is really becoming less and less likely, they would actually feel the need to actually tap into the more extreme approaches, such as using brute force to actually force reunification to happen.
What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I left reporting on China in 2020 absolutely 100% convinced that the Chinese government at some point will go for it. My time reporting in Taiwan, it didn't really change my opinion much, but what they did do is ramp up military drills during that period and made them routine. So I am very, very convinced that they will go for it. We mentioned earlier various timeline scenarios. That centenary of the communist victory in China, 2049, seems inconceivable to me that they would not seek whoever is the leader by then would not seek to have Taiwan under PRC China control by 2049. Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, is currently 72. There's a lot of talk about how if he wants to go down with an incredible legacy that would basically make him the greatest leader since Chairman Mao, or possibly greater, taking Taiwan is how you do it. His mother is 99 and she's still alive. His father lived until he was about 88, I think. So Xi Jinping conceivably could still be alive in 2049. He'd be about 97, but it's probably less likely he would still be in charge at that age. But the point is, there's probably not the urgency to take Taiwan, which would be hugely risky, as William says, in the next year or two. But I think the 2030s is quite possible. And I just left being in the environment of PRC China, the media environment, the political environment. I left convinced that they've put themselves into a position domestically where there's so much nationalism about this. There is so much domestic pressure about this that how could they just let it linger for another 20, 25 years?
As always, a lot of speculation on what Beijing might do next. We'll leave it there. William Young in Taipei and Bill Birtles in our studio. Thank you. And thank you for watching Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service with me, Marika Oi, in Singapore. If you have any questions or thoughts on what we covered in this episode or any other stories from the region, please leave us a comment below and click like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. But until next time, see you.